I wrote that letter in March, by lantern light, with the snow still on the porch rail and my hand shaking from cold or from the stupidity of what I was doing. I have never been certain which. The listing was simple enough. The territorial paper ran a column on Tuesdays, small notices from men who needed a wife for the frontier and women who were willing to come. I had read it for 3 weeks before I wrote anything. Most of the men who placed those notices described themselves honestly, or close enough. A widower with 5 children and a working cattle operation. A fur trapper seeking a companion. A preacher with a small congregation and a sod house that needed a woman's sense. I wrote something different. I said I had an established ranch on the Crail Rim. I said I ran 50 head. I said I had a solid cabin with a proper stove and a good well and a view of the high country that would make a woman forget every hard thing she'd left behind. I said I was 43 years old, which was the truth, and that I was healthy and steady, which was also true, and that I was looking for a sensible woman who wanted a real home on the frontier, not a dream. What I did not say was that the cabin had 2 walls and a roof with a gap in it you could see stars through. What I did not say was that the 50 head I intended to run were, at the time of writing, 7. 6 steers and 1 disagreeable mule named Pharaoh who had come with the claim and seemed to consider himself the primary resident. What I did not say was that the well was there, but the windlass was broken and had been since October, and that I was hauling water from the creek 60 yards below the cabin by hand, twice a day, in a pair of buckets that leaked. I have asked myself in the years since why I wrote it that way. The honest answer is this: I believed every word of it as a thing that would be true, not as a lie but as an intention. I was going to have 50 head by fall. I was going to have the cabin finished by June. The well was going to be fixed. A man building a claim from the ground up in the first year of it is not describing what he has. He is describing what he is building toward. That is not a lie. That is called being a Westerner. I have told that explanation to Delia a number of times over the years. She listens to it politely and then says the same thing she always says, which is, "Orrin, that is the longest way I have ever heard a man say he lied in a letter." She is not wrong. The reply came in 5 weeks, from a woman named Delia Crane of Cooper's Landing, Missouri. The handwriting was the first thing I noticed, clear, level, no flourishes, the kind of hand that has spent a good deal of time writing things that needed to be read by others. A schoolteacher's hand, though I didn't know that yet. The letter itself was 3 paragraphs. The first described her. 36 years old, in good health, no children, had taught school for 11 years before the county consolidated and closed her school, was practical-minded and not easily discouraged by hard work, could cook and keep house and had some experience with horses, could read Latin though she allowed that was probably not relevant. The second paragraph asked a set of questions about the ranch, the acreage, the breed of cattle, the distance to the nearest town, the condition of the road in winter. The third paragraph said that if my answers were satisfactory, she was prepared to come in June, and that she expected honesty in all things and would extend the same in return. I read that third paragraph 4 times. Then I wrote back and answered all her questions, and I was, this time, considerably more careful with the truth. The acreage was accurate. The cattle count I rounded to 40, which was the number I intended to have by the time she arrived, which I did not quite reach. The distance to Sabre Creek was accurate. The condition of the road in winter I described as difficult, which was honest. I did not revisit the state of the cabin. I thought it would be done by June. It was not done by June. It was substantially done by August, which was when she actually arrived, the stagecoach schedule having delayed her departure by 6 weeks, which I have always considered an act of providence. She arrived on a Thursday, the 14th of August, on the noon stage to Sabre Creek Depot. I was there with Pharaoh and the wagon, wearing my good shirt, which I had pressed with a warm stone that morning because I did not own an iron, and which was already showing the morning's drive in the crease across the shoulders by the time the stage pulled in. I stood by the wagon and watched the passengers come down. There were 4 of them, a drummer in a city coat, an older man with a hat box, a woman with a child, and then Delia Crane. I knew her at once. She was the last one off the stage, and she came down the steps with a bag in each hand and a trunk being handed down behind her, and she stood on the depot platform and looked around with the kind of look a person gives a place when they are taking its full measure. Not afraid, not disappointed yet, measuring. She was a tall woman. I had not anticipated that, though I don't know what I had anticipated. Tall and straight-backed, with dark hair pinned up under a gray traveling hat, and a face that was handsome in the way that honest faces are, not a face that asked anything of you, not a face that performed. She wore a gray dress that was plain and well kept and had seen some travel. She had a quiet look about her that I recognized, though it took me time to name it. It was the look of a person who was used to being in charge of a room. She spotted me. She was looking at the 2 men with horses, deciding which of us was her intended, and she went through the calculation quickly and settled on me, probably because the other man was 60 years old and meeting his brother. She walked across the platform toward me. I took off my hat. "Mr. Sable," she said. "Miss Crane," I said. She looked at Pharaoh, she looked at the wagon, she looked at me. Then she said in a voice that was perfectly level, "Where are the rest of the horses?" I said, "This is Pharaoh, he is a mule." "I can see that. I meant the horses from your cattle operation." I said, "The ranch is about 8 miles out. I didn't bring the horses today." She nodded. She was still looking at me with that measuring look, and I had the feeling, clear as a bell, that the measurement was not going in my favor. She said, "Mr. Sable, I would like to ask you something directly, and I would like a direct answer." I said, "All right." She said, "Is the ranch as you described it in your letters?" The depot platform was quiet. The drummer was collecting his bags. The child was crying. The August heat was sitting on everything like a hand. I said, "No, ma'am, it is not." She stood with that for a moment, then she said, "How different?" I said, "Considerably." She said, "In what respects?" I said, "The cattle count is closer to 30 than 50. The cabin is finished now but was not finished when I wrote to you. The well works but the windlass gave me trouble most of the spring." She looked at me steadily. She said, "Is there a proper stove?" I said, "Yes." That part was true. She said, "Is there a view of the high country?" I said, "That part was also true. That part may be the truest thing in the letter." Something moved in her face. Not a smile, not quite. She said, "I see." She picked up her bags. She handed me the heavier one without asking whether I would take it, which I would have, and she walked to the wagon and waited for me to help her up. I did. She sat on the bench with her hands in her lap and her back straight and did not say another word until we were out of town and onto the road. Then she said, "I expect you to make it right, Mr. Sable, not all at once, but steadily. I am not a woman who requires perfection. I am a woman who requires honesty." I said, "I understand that." She said, "Do you?" I said, "I do now." She was quiet for a bit. The road went up through scrub pine, and the country opened on the right into the long view east. I watched her look at it. The high ridgeline of the Crail, the sky behind it going that particular late summer blue that doesn't happen anywhere but up here. She looked at it for a long time. She said finally, "You were right about the view." I said I was. She didn't say anything else for a while. Pharaoh plodded on. The pines thickened. I drove and didn't look at her because I was trying to figure out whether she was staying or going, and I had no way to read it yet, and looking at her would not have helped me. When we came up over the last rise and the claim came into view, the cabin sitting there in the late afternoon sun, the log walls squared up now and the chimney proper, the corral fence running straight to the creek, she looked at it for a long time too. She said, "You built that?" I said, "Yes." She said, "By yourself?" I said, mostly. Charlie Rudd from the valley helped me with the ridge log. She was quiet, then she said, it's solid. I said, I built it to last. She looked at me then, for the first time since we'd left the depot, and this time the measuring had a different quality to it. Less anger, more of something else that I didn't have a name for yet. She said, I'll stay for a week, Mr. Sable. We will see how we do. I said, that's fair. I meant it. A woman who came 1,200 miles on a train and a stage and a wagon seat, and kept her composure through all of it and asked clean, direct questions and looked at a man's work and called it solid before she called it anything else. I meant it. That was fair. More than fair. The first day she asked to see everything. Not the way a woman sometimes tour a property to understand what she's taken on, that resigned, cataloging kind of inspection. She wanted to see it the way a person wants to understand a thing. She walked the fence line and tested the posts. She went into the corral and looked at the cattle, what there were, and asked their ages and their condition, and whether I was planning to breed or sell in the fall. She went to the well and worked the windlass, which I had fixed in May, and pulled up a bucket and looked at the water. She went into the root cellar and looked at what was stored. She came back up and said I was short on salt pork and would need more flour before October. I said, I know. She said, when were you going to address it? I said, before October. She said, good. She went into the cabin and looked at the stove, which was a good one, an Acme range I'd hauled up from Sabre Creek in pieces and assembled myself the previous February. She opened it and looked at the firebox and closed it. She looked at the table and the 2 chairs. She looked at the shelves. She went to the window and looked out at the view, which was the high ridge again, the Crail rim catching the last of the afternoon. She stood there for a while. I stood in the doorway and didn't say anything. She said, without turning around, you live alone up here. I said, 4 years. She said, before that. I said, Colorado, before that Kansas. She said, always alone. I said, mostly. She turned around. She said, Mr. Sable, I am going to say something plainly because I find that is always better. I said, go ahead. She said, you are not what I expected. The ranch is not what I expected. I came out here with a particular picture in my mind and it is not this picture. But this, she gestured at the cabin, the window, the corral outside. This is real work and real effort and real care, and I have been a schoolteacher long enough to know the difference between a man who is building something and a man who is pretending to. You are building something. I said, I am. She said, I would like that week I mentioned. I said, it's yours. She slept in the cabin. I moved my bedroll to the barn, which I had been planning to do regardless. It was a warm August and the barn was dry and clean, and Pharaoh's presence was at least consistent, which is more than I could say for most company. I lay there that first night and thought about how the day had gone, and I decided that it had gone about as well as a man could expect after starting it by confessing on a depot platform that his letter was substantially false. She had not left. She had asked good questions. She had called the cabin solid. She had looked at the view. That was something. The week she asked for became 10 days, then 2 weeks. I did not press her. I did not ask where things stood. I did what I did every day. I worked the claim. I was up before light, had the cattle seen to and the fence checked and the morning's water hauled before she came out of the cabin. She would come out with her hair still pinned up and her sleeves already rolled, and she would start on whatever needed doing inside. She had found the state of my provisions to be only the first of a long list of things she was going to address, apparently, and she worked through that list with the efficiency of a woman who had managed a classroom of 30 children and found a leaking cabin to be a comparatively straightforward problem. She fixed the gap in the window casing I had been meaning to fix since spring. She reordered the shelves so that everything had a logical place rather than the approximate and chaotic arrangement I had developed over 4 years of solo habitation. She found 2 places where the chinking in the north wall had crumbled and mixed new chinking from the pile of clay and straw I had left by the cabin wall. I had not told her it was there. She had found it herself and understood its purpose without asking. She went through my seed stores and told me what to plant in the kitchen garden next spring and in what order. She looked at my accounts. I kept a ledger, simple figures, income and cost, and found 2 errors I had missed. On the 4th day, I came in for the midday meal, and she had venison stew on the stove, and it smelled better than anything I had eaten in 2 years. I said, "Where did you find venison?" She said, "You had a hindquarter hanging in the cellar. You were going to let it age another week, I know, but it was ready." I said, "How do you know when venison is ready?" She said, "My father was a hunter. I butchered my first deer when I was 12. I looked at her. She was setting the table, moving around the small space of the cabin with a competence that I was beginning to understand just how she occupied space. She was not performing usefulness. She was useful the way a good knife is useful, precisely, without display. I said, "What else did your father teach you?" She sat down, she said, "To read, to do arithmetic, to identify the trees by their bark in winter, to know when a man is telling you less than the truth." She said it without any edge, just as a fact. I said, "I'm going to keep apologizing for that letter." She said, "I know, you can stop. I've taken your measure by now and I'm not holding it against you. The letter was wishful. What you've built here is not wishful. Those are different things." I ate the stew. It was as good as it had smelled. Outside the window the Crail rim was doing what it did in the afternoon, the shadow coming down off the high rock in long bands, the sky above it going a deep clean blue. The cattle were in the corral. Pharaoh was being disagreeable about something, which was his occupation. The cabin was warm and it smelled like wood smoke and venison, and the pine soap she'd used to wash the table. I thought, I have been alone on this claim for 4 years and I did not know, until right now, what the word alone meant. I did not say that. I ate the stew and said it was good, which was true, and she said thank you, which she meant, and we sat at the table together in the kind of silence that is not empty. On the 8th day, she said she wanted to ride out and see the upper pasture. I said I would take her. We went on horses. I had borrowed a second horse from Charlie Rudd in the valley, anticipating that she would want to move around the claim, which she did, every day. She rode well, not like a woman who had been taught to sit prettily on a horse. She rode like a woman who had grown up around horses and considered them transportation rather than ornament. She was up in the saddle before I had my foot in the stirrup. We rode the upper pasture and she looked at the grass and asked about the winter grazing and the water source up there, a small spring I had found in my second season. I showed her the spring. She crouched down and looked at it and said it was reliable looking, which it was, and asked whether I had ever had cattle go lame on the rocky ground at the east end of the pasture. I said 2 had. She said we should look at the terrain and consider fencing a corridor to keep them off it. I said I had been thinking the same thing. She said, "When were you planning to do it?" I said probably this fall, before the ground froze. She said that was sensible. We sat up there for a while and ate the bread she had brought in her coat pocket, looking down at the cabin and the corral and the long run of the Crail rim behind it. The high country was still green. August up here has a particular quality, the grass still thick, the air with a first hint of something cooler coming, the sky that impossible depth. She sat on the ridge and ate her bread and looked out at it, and I watched her face instead of the view. There was something there that I had not seen in the first days. The set of her shoulders was different. Still straight, she was always straight-backed. That was just how she was made, but the tightness that had been in them at the depot was gone. She looked like a person who was, cautiously, beginning to feel she was somewhere real. I said, "What made you answer the listing?" She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "The school closing, partly." I said, "And the other part?" She said, "Cooper's Landing is a small place. I had lived there my whole life. After the school closed, I had prospects, you might call them, men who were interested, men I had known for 20 years, men whose whole lives I could see clearly from where I was standing. She looked at the ridge. I didn't want a life I could see the end of before it started. I said, and this? She said, this I could not see the end of. I said, it may have a harder beginning than you expected. She said, Mr. Sable, I grew up in a house where we went without meat 4 months of the year, and my mother kept us in school by taking in sewing. I know what a hard beginning looks like. She looked at me. This is not a hard beginning. This is a good beginning that was described badly. I said, that is a generous way to put it. She said, it is an accurate way to put it. I am usually accurate. I thought about that. I said, the winter is going to be hard up here, real hard, not the kind of hard a person who hasn't seen it imagines. She said, I know. I said, you've never wintered in high country. She said, no, but I read. I asked questions before I came. I wrote to a woman in Wyoming who had homesteaded with her husband for 6 years, and she told me what to expect. I found it alarming, and then I decided to come anyway. She looked at me steadily. I am not a woman who makes decisions without thinking, Mr. Sable. When I am surprised, I am generally not surprised twice by the same thing. I said, no, I don't imagine you are. We rode down in the late afternoon. She cooked. I split wood until the dark came. We ate at the table and talked. She asked about the cattle market in Sabre Creek. I asked about what she had taught in her school. She told me about a particular boy she'd had for 3 years who had gone on to study law. I told her about a cattle drive I'd been on in my 30s that had ended badly, and not in any of the ways a man imagines. She listened to the whole story, and did not offer sympathy where it wasn't called for, and did not judge where a person without full knowledge might have. She laughed once at a part of the story that was genuinely funny, and the laugh was real. None of that polite, held-back thing some women do. She laughed and then shook her head and said that was the worst piece of luck she'd ever heard. I said it got better. She said clearly, you're here. After supper she read by the lamp, and I did the same, and we sat on either side of the table with the lamp between us and the stove ticking in the quiet and the high country dark pressing at the window, and it was, I thought, almost exactly like what I had imagined when I wrote that letter. Not the same. Better in some ways. Real in every way. At the end of the 2nd week, she said she would stay. Not with any ceremony. She came in from the morning milking. I had a cow, I should have mentioned that before, a brown cow named Hazel who was the most placid creature on the property, and she set the milk pail down and said, Mr. Sable, I would like to stay, if that is still your intention. I said, it is. She said, then I think we should be practical about it. I said, all right. She said, I will not pretend that I know you well enough yet to call this anything more than a reasonable arrangement between 2 practical people who appear to suit each other tolerably well. I would like a period of courtship, I suppose, though I recognize that word sounds peculiar in these circumstances. I said, how long a period? She said, until the end of September. We will know by then. I said, that's 6 weeks. She said, yes. I said, I am agreeable to that. She said, good. She picked up the milk pail and went to the stove and started the morning's work, and that was that. 6 weeks. It was the most reasonable thing anyone had ever proposed to me, and also the longest 6 weeks of my life. I should say something about Pharaoh, because he is part of this story whether he deserves to be or not. Pharaoh was a mule of indeterminate age and absolute conviction about his own correctness. He had opinions. He expressed them. He had come with the claim. The previous homesteader had left him behind when he gave up the place, which I always took as evidence that the man had made at least one sound decision. And he and I had spent 4 years in a relationship that I would describe as deeply mutual suspicion, with occasional moments of professional respect. He did not like me. I accepted this. Pharaoh was not a creature who warmed to people easily, and I respected that because I am not either. He liked Delia immediately. I do not know how to explain this, except to say that it happened the second morning she was on the claim. She went out to the barn early. I was still at the creek hauling water, and by the time I came back she was standing in the corral with Pharaoh's enormous gray head resting on her shoulder and her hand moving slowly along his jaw, and the mule had an expression on his face that I had never seen there in 4 years. He looked content. He looked, if it is possible to say this about a mule, grateful. She saw me coming and said, "He is lonely." I said, "He is ornery." She said, "That's what loneliness looks like in something that doesn't know how to ask for company." She looked at me when she said it briefly, and then back at Pharaoh. I went and got the water up to the cabin and thought about that for a while. I thought about it for quite a while. The courtship, if that is the right word for what we were doing, which I maintain it only partially is, looked, from the outside, like two people working a claim together. We were up before light. We worked through the day. We ate together and talked in the evenings. On Sundays we sometimes rode, or she read while I did the week's accounting, or I worked on the fence line and she sat on the fence rail and helped me think through where to run it. But something was happening underneath the work. The work was how she learned me. She watched how I handled the cattle, whether I was patient or rough, whether I paid attention to an animal that was off its feed or walked past it. She watched how I dealt with the fence posts when one split wrong and ruined an afternoon's work, whether I cursed and kicked things or set it aside and figured out another way. She watched how I talked to Charlie Rudd when he came up to borrow the wagon, and how I talked about the man who had tried to graze his cattle on my upper pasture without asking. I had turned him away without a fight but without any warmth either, and she asked about it afterward and listened to the whole account, and said she thought I'd handled it about right. She was measuring me. I knew it. I did not mind it. It was exactly what I would have wanted her to do. What I did not expect was that I was learning her the same way, without planning to. I learned that she was particular about order not for its own sake, but because order meant she could find things when she needed them quickly, and she had spent 11 years in a classroom where losing 10 minutes meant losing 30 children's attention. I learned that she was not sentimental. She had a clear eye for things, but that she was not cold, that there was a warmth in her that was real and deep. It just didn't advertise itself. I learned that she found the high country beautiful in the way that a person finds a thing beautiful when it matches something in them. Not the pretty postcard kind, but the recognition kind. The way you know a piece of country is yours before you can say why. I learned that she was afraid of exactly one thing, which she told me by accident one evening when the wind came up hard from the northwest, and the temperature dropped 40 degrees in an hour the way it does up here in September. She had been fine through the summer storms. She was fine with most things. But that particular wind, that particular dropping cold, made her stop what she was doing in the cabin and stand very still and then go to the window and look out at the darkening sky, and the look on her face was not her usual measuring look. It was something else. I said, "You're thinking about the winter." She said, "I'm thinking about being wrong." I said, "About what?" She said, "About whether I can do this, whether I can winter here. Whether I have what it takes for a place like this." She didn't look at me. I have always known what I could do. I am not a woman who doubts herself, and right now I am not sure. I thought about what to say. I was not a man who offered comfort easily. I had not had much practice at it, and the practice I had was rusty. I said, "Miss Crane." She said, "Delia." She had never said that before. I was still Mr. Sable. She was still Miss Crane. She had just, without making a ceremony of it, changed that. I said, "Delia, I have wintered up here 4 years. 3 of those years I thought about leaving before the spring, not because I couldn't handle it physically, because I was doing it alone and there is a kind of cold that the stove doesn't fix. She was quiet. I said, "That is not going to be this winter." She turned and looked at me then. I said, "You are the most capable person I have had on this claim, including myself, and I have had 4 years to get good at it. You found the chinking problem, the seed order, the salt pork, the east pasture terrain. You fixed the window casing in 20 minutes with tools I didn't know how to use. Pharaoh, who has despised every living thing since I've known him, is in love with you. The winter is going to be hard, and I am not going to lie to you about that, because I have done enough of that already." I stopped. "But you are not going to be wrong about yourself, Delia, that I can tell you." She held my eyes for a moment. Then she said, "All right." She said it quietly, and she turned back to the stove and went back to work, and I went back to what I had been doing, and we did not speak of it again that evening. But something shifted in the room that night. Something that had been held carefully, at a polite distance, moved closer. The end of September came. She had said we would know by then. She was right, as she generally was about timelines she set herself. We were at the table after supper on the last day of September, the lamp lit and the stove going, and the first real cold of the season pressing at the shutters. She had a letter half written to her sister in St. Louis. She wrote to her sister every 2 weeks steady, which was one of the things I had come to know about her, and I had the ledger open. She set down her pen. She said Orrin. It was the first time she had used my given name. I had not asked her to. She had just decided to. I looked up. She said, "I would like to be married before the first snow." I said, "The first snow could be 2 weeks." She said, "I know, we should move quickly." I said, "Delia." She said, "Yes." I said, "I want to be clear about something." She said, "Go ahead." I said, "I did not place that listing because I needed someone to cook and manage the household, though both of those things needed doing. I placed it because 4 years alone up here had taught me that a person cannot live on work and pride alone, and I could not figure out any other way to find someone worth finding. I looked at the ledger and then at her. I found you, and I want you to know that I know the difference between needing a wife and wanting to be married to you specifically, and it is the second one." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is the most words I have heard you say at one time." I said, "I had been holding them a while." She said, "I know." She picked up her pen and then set it back down. "I want to be clear about something as well." I said, "All right." She said, "I did not stay because the ranch is a good investment, though it is. I did not stay because I had nowhere better to go, because I could have gone back. Cooper's Landing would have taken me back. There were those prospects I mentioned." She looked at the lamp. "I stayed because you told me the truth on a depot platform when it would have been easier and perhaps safer for you not to. I stayed because you built that cabin straight. I stayed because you talked to me like a person who could think from the first day, not like a woman who needed to be managed." She looked at me. "And I stayed because this is the first place I have been in a long time where I could see a future that I could not see the end of, and that future has your name on it." I said, "That is a great deal to say." She said, "I had been holding it a while." We went to Sabre Creek 2 days later, and were married by the Justice of the Peace, with Charlie Rudd and his wife standing as witnesses. The first snow came on October the 17th, while the marriage was 3 weeks old. I am going to tell you about that first winter because it is the part of this story that matters most, and because most people who have not wintered in high country do not understand what it is. The cold comes in late October and does not leave until April, and it is not the polite cold of the lower country. It is the kind of cold that is weight. The wind off the Crail Rim can drop the temperature so fast that you can feel it between one breath and the next, and on the worst nights it comes under every door and through every gap, no matter how well you have chenked the walls. The days are short and gray, and the snow comes in waves. The cattle have to be seen to twice a day regardless. The water has to be hauled regardless. The firewood goes faster than you think it will in October. There are days in January when you do not go outside except because you have to, and the cabin is warm and small and the same, and if you are by yourself, those days are the ones that get into you. We were not by ourselves. She had read about the winter. She had written to that woman in Wyoming and done her accounting and made her decisions. What she had not been able to read about and account for was the specific reality of it. The first week of November, when the temperature went to 20 below and stayed there for 4 days. The gray months of December and January, when the sun gave you maybe 5 hours and weak at that. The February storm that kept us inside for a week solid with nothing but each other and the livestock for company. She was not afraid. I want to be accurate about this because it matters. She was not afraid of the cold or the work or the confinement. What she was those first weeks was sometimes overwhelmed in the quiet way that capable people get overwhelmed, not breaking, not complaining, but going still in private for a while, working through it internally. I learned to recognize it, and I learned what to do, which was not to ask and not to fuss, but to be present, to be in the same room doing my own work steady, to have supper ready when she came in from seeing to the livestock, to light the lamp early on the gray days when the dark came down hard. She learned to recognize what I needed too, which was less of something than she needed. I had 4 years of solo practice at the confined cabin winter, but not nothing. What I needed was conversation in the evenings. Real conversation, the kind where the other person thinks and pushes back. I had gone 4 years without that and had not known how much I missed it until I had it again. We talked through those winter evenings the way two people talk when there is nowhere to go and no performance required. We talked about everything: her school, her students, her father and mother, the cattle market, the geology of the Crail Rim which she had read about, the war which had touched both of us at a distance, the question of whether to take on more cattle in the spring or wait another year, what she thought of the territorial politics, what I thought of them. She had opinions on everything. Good ones, often better than mine, because she thought more systematically than I did, and was not burdened by the habit of deciding quickly that 4 years of solo homesteading builds in a man. Pharaoh got her through February. I mean that. The week-long storm in February, when the wind was the kind that makes you wonder if the walls are going to hold, and the temperature outside was something a person shouldn't be out in. She spent 2 hours every day in the barn with Pharaoh. Not because the mule needed it, I was keeping him fine, but because she needed to be with a living thing that was warm and uncomplicated and in no mood for conversation. She would go in and lean against his neck, and he would stand there and not move, the way he did, and she would come back steadier. I understood this completely. There are things a mule can give you that a person cannot: an uncomplicated presence, no judgment, no questions, just warm and solid and there. The storm passed on the 7th day. The sun came out on a world that was all white in silence, the Crail Rim blazing in the morning light. We both went out and stood in it for a while, side by side, breathing the cold, clean air. She said, "We made it." I said, "We did." She said, "Oren." I said, "Yes." She said, "Next winter I want a second cow. Hazel is insufficient for the butter we are going through." I said, "All right." She said, "And a better lamp for the reading corner. The one we have makes me squint." I said, "All right." She said, "And I want to plant a kitchen garden twice the size of what we have. I have a layout planned. I'll show you in the spring." I said, "All right." She looked at me. Something in her eyes was different, had been different for a while, I thought, had been building across those long gray months in the cabin. Not the measuring look from the depot, not the careful courtship look from September. Something that had passed through all of those and come out the other side. She said, "You are a good man, Oren Sable." I said, "I wrote a dishonest letter." She said, "You told the truth when it counted and you have not stopped since. That is what a good man does." She looked at the ridge. He does not do it perfectly from the start. He just does it when it matters and then keeps doing it. I did not say anything for a moment. The cold was real and the light off the snow was sharp, and the Crail rim stood where it had always stood, enormous and indifferent to us both, which is what I love about mountains. They give you your size back. I said, Delia. She said, yes. I said, I am going to say something. She said, all right. I said, I am grateful for the dishonest letter. She looked at me. I said, not for the dishonesty, for the letter, for the fact that I wrote it. If I had written an honest letter, I would have described a half-built cabin and 1 mule and 30 head, and a windlass that didn't work and a view that I could not adequately put into words, and you would have written back something polite and declined, and I would have spent another winter up here alone and never known the difference. I looked at the ridge. The letter was wrong, but the impulse behind it was right. I was building towards something. I just didn't know yet that the something was you. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought I had said too much, which was my general experience with saying things. Then she said, that is an impossible thing to argue with. I said, I know. She said, it is also, if I am being accurate, the most romantic thing I have ever been told. I said, I will try not to let it go to my head. She laughed, that real laugh, nothing held back. It went out into the cold, clear morning, and the ridge took it up. The spring came the way spring comes in high country, slowly, and then all at once, and then with a ferocity that makes you remember why it took so long. We planted the kitchen garden twice the size of the previous years. The layout she had worked out on paper through January and February in the reading corner under the insufficient lamp. We took on 12 more cattle in April, bringing the count to 42, and I built a second corral beside the first to handle the increase. She got her second cow, a brindled heifer she named Tuesday, which I did not ask about, and the butter situation was resolved. Charlie Rudd came up in May and helped me put in the fence corridor at the east end of the upper pasture, the one Delia had identified as the problem in August. She was right. As it turned out, we lost no cattle to lameness the following season. She wrote to her sister in St. Louis and described the winter accurately, and the sister wrote back and said it sounded terrifying, and Delia wrote back and said that was because her sister had no imagination for what real home felt like. I read that letter over her shoulder one evening, and she did not tell me to stop. I am an old man now, or close enough. The Crail rim has not moved. The claim has grown. We run close to 100 head now, and the cabin that Delia declared solid in August of the year we met has had 2 rooms added to it and a proper window in the reading corner with a lamp she selected herself from the catalog. The garden she laid out that first spring is the largest kitchen garden in this part of the high country, and people from the valley come to Delia in the spring to ask about timing and soil amendment, and which varieties will hold through the altitude, and she tells them, because she has spent 40 years learning this ground. Pharaoh died in our 7th year of marriage. He was old when I got him, and he had a good end. Delia was with him. I found her afterwards sitting in the barn with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up, not crying. She was not a woman who cried easily, but with a look on her face like she had lost something irreplaceable. Because she had. Some things are irreplaceable. We have buried things and built things and argued and come to agreements and been wrong and admitted it and been right and not made a great occasion of it. We have had winters that tried us and springs that felt like grace. We have had seasons of plenty and seasons where the numbers were close enough that I did the ledger twice to make sure I hadn't missed anything. We have worked this ground until we know it the way you only know a thing when you have been afraid for it and grateful for it in equal measure. When people ask how we came to be here, and they ask, because Delia is the kind of woman who makes people curious, who has the kind of presence that prompts the question. She tells the story better than I do. She is a better storyteller. She taught school for 11 years. She knows how to structure a narrative and where to put the pause. She always ends it the same way. She says, "He told me the cabin was solid before he told me anything else. That was the moment I decided to stay." I have heard her tell that story dozens of times. Every time she says that, I look at my hands. I built that cabin solid because I built everything I intended to keep that way. I did not know, when I was squaring those logs in the cold spring of that year, that the most important thing the cabin would ever do was give a woman who had come 1,200 miles to find a home a reason to believe she had found one. I know it now. That is the thing about building towards something when you do not yet know what the something is. You just have to build it right and trust that when the something arrives, it will see that you were trying. She saw. I have not needed to ask for more than that. The Crail rim is doing what it always does this evening, catching the last of the light, going gold along the high edge, the shadow coming down slow. The kitchen garden is in for the season. The cattle are in the pasture. Tuesday's successor is in the barn. The lamp in the reading corner is lit. I can hear Delia inside, moving around, the particular rhythm of her moving through that space that I have had 40 years to learn and that I would know in the dark. I told that letter's story to a young man last spring, a homesteader, new to the valley, nervous, asking about taking on a mail-order arrangement. He wanted to know if it could work. I told him this. It can work. But you have to tell the truth on the depot platform the day it counts. Whatever you didn't say in the letter, you say on the platform, straight out, and you stand there and take whatever comes from it. He asked, and if she goes? I said, then you didn't lose much, because a woman who goes when you tell her the truth was never going to stay through the winter anyway. And the winter is what this life is built on. He asked, and if she stays? I looked at the Crail rim. I thought about a woman stepping off a stage with a bag in each hand and a measuring look, and a depot platform in August heat, and a mule with his head on a woman's shoulder, and a first snow on October the 17th, and 40 years of this ground. I said, if she stays, you will spend the rest of your life being grateful for the honest letter you wrote instead of the one you almost wrote. He looked uncertain. Young men usually do. I left him to think about it and came home. The lamp is lit. The ridge is gold. I am grateful for every word.